I'm going to be talking about fear. And I know there can be a lot of components to this. You may be thinking, okay, well, what the heck is she going to talk about? I'm going to talk about identifying fears, steps to take to overcome those fears, and kind of what facing adversity and fear kind of looks like overall. So just to start off, what exactly is fear and how many definitions of it? Well, there are a lot, and here are a few. So first, obviously, this is fear used as a noun, and then this is fear used as a verb, but just for some examples, an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or threat. A mixed feeling of dread and reverence, and then, for instance, to avoid or put off doing something because one is afraid, used to express regret or an apology. So I kind of have a view on life. I don't think a lot of things are accomplished without vulnerability, so I'm going to be vulnerable for a second. These are some of my fears. These are not all of my fears. These are very small examples of my fears, and you all might be looking at these and saying, wow, she might need counseling. That may or may not be true. But these are some of the paralyzing fears that I have dealt with through my life, I'm still dealing with, and I will continue to deal with. I'll talk about one. I'll talk about two at large, and then we'll move forward with the exercise. So first, money's manipulation over lives. My mom losing all of her money. You may be thinking, okay, well, what is she talking about? In society in general, money is power. I think that that's something that's pretty evident. People that have more money sometimes get things more accomplished. Others that don't, life is harder for them. My mom is a business owner. She has owned her own boutique for 28 years. She's never had any large financial issues. She's never filed for bankruptcy. There has been no issues or stated facts that she has had any money troubles. I have had this fear essentially my entire life, and something that kind of caused it to be crippling. So up until about 3 years ago, anytime we would go to the grocery or we would buy back to school clothes, get anything like that, I would have to physically remove myself from the checkout line so I did not hear the total once it was released after she had purchased anything. You all are probably thinking, like, that is so weird. Yes, it is weird. I would just have this overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety that I was causing her to spend money on my sister and I, therefore taking money away from herself, i.e. somehow her becoming bankrupt and having no money and being homeless. That is an irrational fear. It probably will never happen. It most definitely will never happen. Still something I'm very afraid of. Another one, something that kind of has subliminal meshing, is the moving home paradigm. I'm obviously not from Nashville. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, and I went away to college. I wanted to move away from home after college, but a very small piece of me is always homesick and fearful that I'm missing out on this life that my mom and my sister are having. They work together. They interact daily. Even though I talk to my mom daily, I get a little sad and fearful that I'm missing out. Yet, I'm also sad and fearful that if I do in fact move home, I will feel like I'm missing out on opportunities, maybe not meeting someone that could be greater elsewhere in the universe, things like that, i.e. the moving home paradigm. So I gave you all a sheet. It has a blank space on the top, and then there's a line divided, and then it says 1, 2, 3. There should be a surplus amount on tables, and then if anyone needs extra, there's one right here on the tall table. I encourage you all to write down a couple of your fears. Things that you are afraid of, whether that's relational fears, whether that's in your career, maybe something that you've been struggling with. What are you fearful of? And be kind of candid with yourself. My fancy countdown. Make sure that you all are kind of being true to what you're feeling in your head, and put those fears down to paper. So now that you've written down these fears, you're kind of putting that into the universe. I'm going to talk about something called the feararchy. So Dr. Carl Albrecht, he kind of came up with this, talking about the majority of the fears at large and kind of where they fall in this pyramid scheme. So obviously, ego, death, separation, loss of autonomy, mutilation, and extinction. And you all are probably thinking, okay, well, what does that mean, and where do these correlate to what I'm fearful of? So an example of one. So the loss of autonomy. The fear of being immobilized, paralyzed, restricted, enveloped, overwhelmed, entrapped, imprisoned, smothered, or otherwise controlled by circumstances beyond our control, in a physical form commonly known as claustrophobia. But it also extends into our social interactions and relationships. Fear, for instance, maybe being left in a relationship, fear of rejection, asking someone on a date and them turning you down, saying no, being in an uncomfortable position, any type of abuse and things like that. That's directly correlated to that burdened fear. And so I would say the majority of us probably suffer from a couple of these. Some of you all may suffer from all of these, but mostly ego death. So these are some examples of ego-based fear. Fear of failure, fear of success even, fear of humiliation, fear of loss, and fear of uncertainty. A lot of these can kind of be summarized into a couple examples of fear, and this is mostly in terms of society what we're fearful of the most of. But there's one thing to keep in mind. None of these fears are real. And that's because they're as big as you make them, but sometimes they're not actually tangible. In fact, they're fears that you have put into your head, but they don't actually resonate with any real truth. So this next slide is going to kind of seem slightly ironic, but fear must still play a role. And I read a lot of books and watched a lot of TED Talks specifically on fear. And this was one of the greatest quotes that I pulled out of it. It says the following. This is by Dr. Carmen Hara. She said, "We would live with reckless abandon if we knew no notion of fear, performing all sorts of downright dangerous activities. The key is to distinguish between actions which induce a healthy acknowledgement of apprehension versus illogical triggers of fear which stifle our potential and limit our well-being." So in layman's terms, you're supposed to be fearful of things, and if we weren't, we would completely be entirely reckless, and half of us in this room would probably be dead. A good amount of fear is important, but the right kind, not ones that stump your personal growth, achieving your goals, things like that. Which brings me to this guy. So this is Tim Ferriss, and he talks about fear setting. So it's a couple of examples that he came up with about how to address your fears and overcome them and not let your fears overcome you. The first one is this. So obviously there'll be 3 for those 1, 2, 3s on your paper. First is define. What is the worst thing that can happen if this fear comes true? You can pick one of them. This can be for all of them. What is the worst thing that can happen if, in fact, this fear does come true? If it comes to fruition, it happens to you, it occurs. So one of my fears on there, as I put, was being fired. I have this weird, irrational fear that I'm going to make some big flub up and I'm just going to be fired for no reason, jobless and homeless and whatever. What's the worst thing that could happen if I got fired? Just putting that into the universe. What's the worst thing that could happen if I got a divorce? What's the worst thing that could happen if I got Alzheimer's? Things like that. Secondly, prevent. What could you do to prevent from happening or decrease the likelihood? For instance, losing your job. Well, asking for feedback, making sure that you're staying on top of your game, constantly reminding yourself to peak perform, treating each day as a new opportunity, things like that. And then lastly, repair. If the worst happens, what do you do to repair or damage or mend the issue? What are steps that you're going to take to have this either be prevented or adjusted? I know a lot of people are like, well, I'm fearful of death. Okay, well, what happens if I die? Well, it's kind of an end-all be-all. But what are the reasons why you're afraid of dying? Are you afraid of dying because you're going to leave your family? Are you afraid of dying because you feel like it's going to inflict physical pain upon yourself? What is the true root as to why you are actually afraid of dying? And then in turn, it might help solve the reasoning behind it. So lastly, the cost of inaction. What happens if this doesn't happen and you avoid the action or the decision? What does your life look like? If you continue to have this fear, if you continue to let this inhibit your behavior, what does your life look like in 6 months? What does your life look like in 1 year? What does your life look like in 3 years? And whether that's something within your career, your relationship, something maybe physical you're not trying to achieve, what burden are you putting on yourself, your emotional state, your physical state, your financial state, because you're not taking the steps to conquer this fear and no longer letting it allow to cripple you? So the solution is inaction is not an option. You'll live with fears forever, but it's not an option to just ignore them, or else you're only hindering yourself. So I hope that kind of from these you've been able to, if anything, write your fears down to paper, because when I was coming up with how I was going to kind of put these slides together and talk about everything in general, just the simple fact of removing those fears from my mind and putting them down was a step forward, in my opinion. Putting those into the universe and understanding, wow, these are some real things that I'm troubling with. So if I can leave you all with anything, it's these 3 things. Face the fear, feel the fear, and fuck the fear, because you're bigger and you're better than the fear, and you deserve to achieve all the dreams you want. Thanks so much, guys.